Okay, I record these to prevent anyone in the audience being rude to me. So I think it's rather a good ploy. So let me just remind you what we were doing last week. Last week we did a whole shtickle that was in relation to the na'anuim, the shaking of the lulav in the various directions: forward, right, left, behind, up, down, all that stuff. We discussed the positions in Hallel, or shall we say the places in the recitation of Hallel that those shakings take place, on the Honor Hashem Oshionar, on the Hodula Hashem, etc. And I showed you the Hallel as it's actually in Tehillim, and how we actually split it up when we do our recitation of the Hallel at Shul, and the points at which we actually do that, those movements. The Gemara tried to give some rationale, apart from quoting the fact that there is a very distant hint in the pasuk to shaking the Arba Minim during Hallel. The Gemara tried to give us some rationales as well, some sforot. And there were two really. One of them was that when we move the lulav in the various directions, we're acknowledging the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in charge of all the different points on the globe, if you like, north, west, east, and south. It's an indication that we understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be the master of the world and everything on it. Maybe Sukkot is a good time for this. We've taken in our crops. We may feel ourselves to be somewhat in charge, which is why we make ourselves somewhat vulnerable. It's an antidote to this feeling of triumph and ownership, that we move into the sukkah, which is a booth, a simple hut, brings us down to earth, so to speak, with a bump. And also when we shake the lulav and we moved around the directions, one of the species that represents food, the palm tree, which gives form dates, we also using that to point to all the various directions and essentially affirming that it's not us that is in control, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that was one possible interpretation of the shakings that we do during Hallel. And also when we make the bracha, we said also when we make the bracha, we also do those traditional shakings. We understand those to be rabbinic. They're not min ha-Torah. It's not like the mitzvah of ulakachtem lochem, the Torah's mitzvah is to take the lulav and esrog, which we do in make a bracha, but not those additional shakings. Those additional shakings are further insights that we've built into the mitzvah of sukkah, even though there's a remez in Tanakh. Another reason was given, which was not so much an affirmation, but rather a request to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to protect us. He said there, Rabbi Chama Bar Ukva, Kedei la'atzar ruchos ro'os tolalos ro'os, in order to prevent the bad winds and the bad rains, so to speak. We've had our crops, etc., but we know that we need to protect our fields. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please be our shield and protect us from harmful physical events, floods, storms, etc., which we see very much prevalent in our world today, as a matter of fact. Climate change, prevent climate change. So that's another reason for doing the Na'anuim. We ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you like, to remember the nature that he's built. We're shaking this lulav and esrog, and that's part of nature, the ingredients of the mitzvah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should preserve the nature and the ecology, if you like. That's another reason that was given. The Gemara said, interestingly, brought a practice of one of the Amorim, which it then condemned. This Amora used to, when he did his shaking, he used to pronounce Dein gira be'einei de sotana. When I'm doing this and I'm plunging forward, so to speak, with my lulav, this is symbolic of me thrusting a spear into the eyes of the Satan. Very strange and aggressive statement. Maybe that's the way he plunged his lulav forward. What he meant to say is, it depends what you mean by Satan, by the way. Satan has two possible connotations here. You can refer to Satan as the if you like, the prosecution council of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, some sort of malach that under Hashem's instructions, not independently, is the force for prosecution, if you like, and for condemnation of people. Or you can refer to Satan as simply being the Yetzer Hara. Over here, most of the Farshim say that Satan is the Yetzer Hara. It's the bad bits within us are referred to as the Satan. Two actually very different ideas behind Satan. But when this Amora used to thrust forward his lulav, he sort of said, essentially, I have nothing to fear from the Satan anymore. I can confront it directly, and I can even stab it in the eye. And I'm not concerned about the Yetzer Hara. And the Gemara says, this is bad practice. Lav milsa. This is not a thing to do, because anything you do to provoke the Satan will only bring him back in greater force. Or another way of saying it is, anything you do to prime yourself up against the Yetzer Hara, to pretend that you vanquished it, will bring the Yetzer Hara back again in a new guise, against which you won't perhaps be able to defend yourself. So rather, better the devil you know, this is literally true now in the way you're learning Gemara, than the devil you don't know. You know the Satan, you can handle it, but don't stick a blade in its eye and say, try harder, because you never know, the Satan might be able to overcome you. This is bad practice. And generally speaking, this is an idea, actually, not just in terms of Satan. There's a Gemara says something very similar about the Umos Ha'olam, the nations of the world. Also last Guri, the Umos Ha'olam. This is a very difficult passage, and Zionism may take a different view, but it is that if it seems that there are Rishonim in the world, and those Rishonim are in the ascendant, then we shouldn't provoke them unnecessarily. Instead of saying, you know what, we're so strong now, you know, these people have been our enemies for so long, it's about time now we went out and liquidated them. Not so fast. It's better not to do so. Possibly by doing this, you'll bring another one in its train. So this is something that applies not just in terms of your own personal Yetzer Hara, but there's a certain philosophy here against taking on battles unnecessarily. We have to take on the battles that we need to take on, and rather than looking to vanquish any potential adversary, even though we still have some level of freedom. Okay, now we're going to move on to this next mission. This next Mishnah is on 38a, Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, and it's about 6-7 lines down from the top, very easy to find. Masnisin Misha Bar Derech, 6 or 7 lines down from the top. This Mishnah has nothing to do with shakings anymore. We finished our shaking. We're now on a halacha that relates to the importance of doing this mitzvah and doing it quickly, so we don't come to the point of forgetting what mitzvah we're talking here about. Taking Arba Minim. Someone who hasn't yet taken Arba Minim, has he got all day? Can he delay it? Can he hope that he won't forget? So this Mishnah is actually similar to a few Mishnahs we find in other places in terms of Kiddush on Shabbos, Mincha, Tefillah. There's a parallel between this particular halacha here and some other mitzvot that we need to be careful about. We might come to forget them if we don't take them up with zerizus, with haste. So says the Mishnah, brings an example actually. Misha Bar Derech, someone who came back from a journey, usually that's what it means, Misha Bar Derech. Certainly the Gemara is going to understand that later. It just doesn't just mean someone who's come into the house from doing some local shopping. But he comes home, and let's say it's Chol Hamoed Sukkos, because he's come on a journey, he's just finished a journey. Is he going to be doing a journey on Yom Tov? It's unlikely. So it's likely we're talking about Chol Hamoed. All that the Gemara will flesh out as well. Below Hoyo B'yodo Lulav Litol. And during the journey, he had no lulav and esrog to take, and now it's already way through the day a little bit. So he didn't bench lulav in the morning. He had to go out. Maybe he had to go out before it was time to take lulav. You can't take lulav during the night. It says b'yom harishon, and that's taken as a model for all the mitzvahs of sukkah of all the days, that it should be b'yom v'lo b'layla. So he hasn't taken it yet, didn't have the opportunity. Comes back at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He's starving, hungry. So says the Mishnah, Lishi yikones leveso yitol al shulchano. As soon as he enters home, he needs to go to the table and take up his lulav and esrog and make a bracha and be mekayim the mitzvah. And as the Gemara explains, this means that he needs to do so as the very first thing that enters his mind. So, for example, if he has sat down to have a meal when he's come back in again because he was so hungry, and then he remembers, I haven't taken lulav and esrog, the Gemara is going to say, he has to immediately bench, or he doesn't have to bench maybe just to make lulav, say take lulav and esrog, but he certainly has to put down his meal, move to the other room, take up his lulav and esrog, make a bracha before he can finish his meal. He's not allowed to say to himself, you know what, it doesn't get dark for another 5 hours. I'll be finished eating in half an hour. I'll bench and then I'll take lulav and esrog. I have plenty of time. I haven't missed the mitzvah. The Mishnah is telling you that you can't take that law into your own hands, but rather you have to take lulav and esrog at the first opportunity, even though there's time left in the day. Okay, that seems like a fairly straightforward, good piece of advice, right? Most people say, don't delay. If you do delay, you never know, you might come to forget, you might fall asleep at the table or whatever it is. So there's nothing controversial in that. Now the Mishnah goes on to say something else that doesn't seem terribly controversial. The Gemara is going to discuss the fact that it may pose a contradiction with the first part of the Mishnah. Lo notal shachris, Yitol ben harbayim, shekol hayom kosher lelulav. If he hasn't taken the lulav in the morning, for whatever reason, he wasn't able to bench lulav in the morning, so he hasn't yet done his mitzvah, then he needs to do so in the afternoon. In other words, he shouldn't say to himself, well, I've missed the morning, so maybe I won't do the mitzvah today. I mean, it seems a bit obvious. Shekol hayom kosher lelulav. This is really what the Mishnah means to tell you, that you can take the lulav at any time during the day. In other words, not that you should wait, but rather that if you take the lulav and it's not yet dark, you are yotza at the end of the day. You're yotza, your mitzvah of lulav. No one's going to say that you haven't fulfilled it, even if you do so a few minutes before nightfall. So at no point is it too late to fulfill the mitzvah of arba minim as long as it hasn't yet got dark. Okay, let's start the Gemara. It doesn't seem to be anything terribly difficult about this Mishnah so far. You're probably wondering why you've had such an easy ride. The Gemara isn't terribly difficult either, but it's going to get beneath the surface of some of these basic questions of when you should do a mitzvah quickly and put all else aside, when you can just relax and perhaps say, I've got plenty of time. Because after all, that's the topic of the Mishnah, delay or not delay. So it says the Gemara. So the Gemara is now going to bring what it seems to be to the Gemara at this point, a contradiction between our Mishnah here and a Mishnah in Psachim. So let's see how it goes. Actually, this one's in Shabbos. Omrat, says the Gemara is sort of in a dialogue with itself, or you can imagine a Bnei Yeshiva were talking to each other. Omrat, you have just said, in other words, someone who recites the Mishnah will just have recited the Mishnah we've recited. So it says the Gemara as if one of the Talmudim in the Yeshiva said, Omrat, you have just said when you recited the Mishnah, note lo al shulchono, the first thing you need to do when you get back home is to pick up the lulav and esrog and make a bracha. If you come from a journey in Cholamod Sukkos, you can't do anything else. You have to interrupt anything else that might come your way. As soon as you're in the home, you have to do the mitzvah. Lememra damafsik, which suggests that you have to interrupt anything else you're doing. In particular, when it says mafsik, it means mafsik seudah, because that's the context of mafsik and every other thing. If you are eating, so you came home, as I said, you were very hungry, you didn't pick up lulav and esrog because you forgot this Mishnah. And then you started eating. Then you remember. Then you, according to this Mishnah, says the Gemara, you have to put down your knife and fork, or if you eat with your fingers, you have to clean your hands off, etc., and make a bracha on the lulav and esrog. That's what our Mishnah suggested. Seems quite straightforward. But says the Gemara, this is in contradiction to a Mishnah we learned elsewhere. Uraminhu. And we can throw a contradiction against this Mishnah from one that we find in Masechah Shabbos, where it says, "Im hischilu ein mafsikin," that if they have started, they don't need to stop. What's this talking about? This is talking about a person who's davening mincha or hasn't yet davened mincha and needs to daven mincha. And the Mishnah says that if the time for mincha has come already, you've got several hours to daven mincha, but the time for mincha has come, it's afternoon, and you haven't davened mincha yet, because you were expecting to go to, I don't know, a meal, a minyan at 5:30 or 6 o'clock or whatever, and it's just 3 o'clock. But the time for mincha has come. If you started to eat, ein mafsikin, you don't need to stop your meal and daven mincha, and then go back to your meal. Rather, you can finish your meal at leisure and daven mincha later on. Now, that's all. Nowadays, we have our lunch anyway, whatever time it is in daven mincha. But over here, the Gemara is taking the view. I'm sorry, this happened last week, and it's happened again. Could you please? Are we back again? We are back again. Okay. So the Mishnah said in another Masechta that if you haven't yet daven mincha and you started to eat a meal, then you don't need to close down the meal and daven mincha, even though now it's time for mincha. So the Gemara has a kasha over here, drawing a parallel between davening mincha, which is a mitzvah, and you're eating, and the need to take lulav and esrog, which is a mitzvah, and you're eating. Our Mishnah says over here, you have to abandon your meal and shake lulav and esrog, but you don't have to abandon your meal to daven mincha. So why is there a difference? The Gemara suggests, unless you can explain why there ought to be a difference, there should be no difference. So this seems to be a stira, a contradiction. So Amar Rav Safra lo kasha. Just highlight myself again. Rav Safra says, lo kasha, there is no kasha between these two cases. It is not difficult. Hard to ikashas bayom, hard to lekashas bayom. This is a little bit of a, shall we say, an artificial answer, because there does seem to be a contradiction between these two in terms of what seems to be a fair parallel. Says the Gemara, no. When our Mishnah says over here that as soon as you get home, you have to take your lulav and esrog, and if you're in the middle of a meal, you need to stop the meal. That's because here there isn't shas bayom. We're very, very close to the end of the day. So by the time you finish your meal, it'll be night, and you won't be able to do the mitzvah anymore. So that's why our Mishnah over here says that you've got to you've got to take lulav and esrog, and you've got to stop your meal in order to do so, because if you don't do so, you won't have enough time to do the mitzvah. But the Mishnah that was talking about davening mincha is in a different scenario. That's a scenario where you're eating a meal, and you've got plenty of time left for mincha. There'll be hours left after you've eaten the meal. So there the Mishnah is not too strict. It says you can stretch out your meal a little bit, you'll still be down for a mincha, we're not so worried. That's the Gemara's answer over here. In the case of the our Mishnah here, where you have to interrupt the meal, it's because otherwise you won't have enough time to do the mitzvah. So you must interrupt and do the mitzvah. Whereas the Mishnah in the Masechah Shabbos, it talks about davening mincha, is in a scenario where you can eat your meal and still have plenty of time. There's no fear that you're going to miss the time. That's the Gemara's answer over here. It's not a very good answer, and the Gemara is going to really say it's a very good answer. First, let's just remember that this is artificially putting words into the mouth of the Mishnah. Yes, I mean, the Mishnah here doesn't say that there isn't going to be enough time in the day. It says straightforwardly, you're having a meal, stop your meal, even if there's 10 hours left in the day. It doesn't say anything about being so close to nightfall. Neither does the Mishnah in the other Masechta say that there's bags of time. So this has been a very artificial delineation between the circumstances of our Mishnah here in Sukkah and that in relation to Mincha. It answers the question, but only by painting a picture of the situation, which differentiates between this case here and the other case. So if we go on with the Gemara, so Amar Rava, so Rava said, my kusha, he says, I don't need to make, as I said to you, it wasn't a very good answer, I don't need to make a differentiation between these two to say the case of Arba Minim here was where he wouldn't have had enough time, and the case of Mincha where he doesn't have to interrupt his meal when he's got bags of time. I don't have to say that at all. There's a very straightforward difference between these two halachot. The halacha of Arba Minim and the halacha of davening mincha. And that will explain why you have to interrupt one and not the other. What's the straightforward difference? So says the Gemara, Dilma, perhaps the reason for the difference in halacha is because ha d'oraisa, ha d'rabbanan. One is d'oraisa, one is Torah mandated, and the other one is rabbanon, is rabbinically mandated. One is a more serious, heavy mitzvah than the other. Now, it's clear that what the Gemara means to say here, Rava's response, is that the mitzvah of Sukkah is minhat, a mitzvah of lulav on Sukkot is minhat Torah. Well, of course it is. It's a pasuk. Ulukachtem lochem b'yom harishon. You know, whatever it says, pre tzada kapos tomorrow, etc. It's a mitzvah minhat Torah. That, says Rava, is why you have to interrupt your meal if you haven't yet taken Arba Minim. You have to stop your meal because this mitzvah is a heavyweight mitzvah, the mitzvah Arba Minim. We can't allow any possibility of slippage. And therefore, we're concerned you might miss the mitzvah, you might forget, or whatever. Abandon your meal now and do the mitzvah. However, the mitzvah of davening, what is the mitzvah of tefillah? So says the Gemara over here, and this is actually a long controversy in the Gemara amongst Rishonim and Acharonim, etc., that the mitzvah of davening is rabbinic. You're going to daven mincha, you're going to be fulfilling a mitzvah drabanon. You're a good boy, and you have to, because we have to do mitzvahs drabanon as well as mitzvahs minat Torah. In fact, in our fulfillment of mitzvahs, we try not to differentiate between the two. There are differences in halacha on the case of safek, if you're not sure if you've done it or not. But in terms of the need to do it in the first place, they're just as important. However, it could be that the Chazal said that when it comes to davening mincha, since it's only a mitzvah drabanon, if there's time left in the day anyway, finish your meal. We're not going to force you to bench up and daven mincha and then come back to part two of your meal. We're not going to force you to do that. If it had been a Torah mitzvah, we would, like this case of Arba Minim. But in the case of a rabbinical mitzvah, we don't need to do that. Now that sounds like a good differentiation. That will be the distinction between the case of davening, where you don't have to interrupt your meal, and the case of lulav and esrog, where you do. And it's got nothing to do whether there's time or not time. It's simply that one is a heavyweight. In both cases, there was time. But one's a heavyweight mitzvah, and therefore you've got to do it, even though there's time. And the other one is not so heavy. So therefore we say, wait till you finish your meal. This is Robert's response. I just want to share with you, if I can find it. If you look at Rambam Hilchos Tefillah, you get the source, what seems to be the opposite halacha. The very first halacha on Hilchos Tefillah, Rambam quotes a pasuk for Tefillah, and it says, "V'avadetem es Hashem Elokechem," as I've highlighted to you. And what does that mean? That you shall serve your Hashem. So the serve, what does it mean by avodah? And this is going to be the crux of it. Mitzvahs aseh lehispalel b'chol yom. It is a positive mitzvah min haTorah to daven every day. Shenemar Elohechem. I think it means V'avadetem es Hashem Elokechem. I think something's gone wrong with the quote. Mipi hashmuah lomdu. We interpret this to mean she'avodah zu hi tefillah, When it says Va'avadatem as Hashem, it means as if it were you shall pray to Hashem. Avodah is not referring to effort. Remember the Kohanim, when they do their service in the Beis HaMikdash, that's called Avodah as well. Because, remember, our tefillah is modeled on the Avodah of the Kohanim in Beis HaMikdash. So today our Avodah is tefillah. Ve'ein minyan hatefillah is min haTorah. Ve'ein mishnah hatefillah is min haTorah. Ve'ein hatefillah is man gavua min haTorah. He does go on to say, he quotes, by the way, Ulo avdo b'chol avavachem in Kriyas Shema. So the word avdo, to serve him, it says with all your hearts. How do you serve with all your heart? It's talking about your emotional thing, which is tefillah. So therefore, avdo is a terminology to use to describe prayer. And you need to pray every day. The only thing the Rambam does add over here is that the number of tefillahs in the day are not fixed. Neither is the text of the tefillah in a day fixed, nor is the time for tefillah in a day fixed. In other words, and this is a very, very important yesod of the Rambam, he says there is a chiyuv min haTorah to daven, but it's at a very, very general level. As long as you pray to Hashem at least once a day, whenever it is, and whatever you say, you'll be mekayim the mitzvah min haTorah of tefillah. Now, if you want to, later on, Chachamim implemented a nusach that we have, Shacharis, Mincha, and Marav, etc., and that now is incumbent on us. But that wasn't min haTorah. Min haTorah, there is din of tefillah at least once a day. Now, other Rishonim don't actually necessarily hold the same, that there's even a mitzvah min haTorah to daven once a day. You might say, why not? Simply because you can't find anything directly in the Torah. Where does the Torah say directly? That you shall pray to me? You won't find it. So there isn't an explicit mitzvah min haTorah to pray. There's only one area where you can say it might be min haTorah. That's when there is a plague or sickness in the town, or a catastrophe has happened, and it seems then you can interpret the psukim in Parshas Bamidbar to say that there's a din of tefillah. But simply on a daily basis to say there's a mitzvah of tefillah, Rambam's giving us a source for a very pared down mitzvah min haTefillah min haTorah. Everything we do in excess of this is rabbinic. Nevertheless, just stop sharing a moment. The Ramban doesn't hold that this posuk that I've just shown you in the Rambam is a source. Nachmanides doesn't hold it's a source for tefillah min haTorah. It's rabbinic in terms of the daily need to pray. So he actually says, I can prove my point, says the Rambam, that the Rambam Maimonides is wrong. Because over here in the Gemara, it says that sukkar is min haTorah and tefillah is drabanan. End of argument. So how can the Rambam Maimonides say, he quotes this postuk, Va'avadatem as Hashem Elokeichem? So that's what the Ramban uses as a proof to show that prayer is totally rabbinic. It's not a particularly good kasha on the Rambam, as the commentaries on the Rambam say, because the Rambam can easily answer you to say, hey, I didn't say davening mincha was a mitzvah min haTorah. In fact, I said there is no fixed times for davening. And I also said there isn't even a fixed number of tefillahs. At least you do one. That's all you need to do. This Gemara could be talking about where it says that tefillah's rabbanon. The person's already done his first tefillah of the day, right? Maybe he did shachris. He doesn't have to do mincha. That's already drabbon once he's done one, according to Rambam. And indeed, if all he said is, good, my dear God, help me go through a difficult day. I'm going to have a job interview today. According to Rambam, hey presto, he's davened. Mincha then is not anymore min haTorah. It becomes only rabbinic. It's surplus to the Torah's requirements. So the Rambam would say this is not a kasha. It doesn't show that the essence of Torah of tefillah is rabbinic. It only shows that davening mincha is rabbinic, and it could be you've davened something else already, and that's fine. That could be the situation. But essentially, at its basis level, at its most fundamental level, Rambam will claim there is a mitzvah min haTorah to daven once a day. So I say, according to Nachmanides, there wouldn't be. You could go through a whole day, and if nothing was particularly tearing at your heartstrings, you wouldn't have to daven. You have to do mitzvahs, but davening, at least min ha-Torah. Of course, the Rambam daven, but that's rabbinic. So we're talking here only about whether something is Torah mandated or whether it's rabbinically mandated. I just wanted to make that clear. Okay. Ella Amar Rava. We'll just go on with the Gemara. Rava said, don't forget, he said there was no problem between the Mishnah here about a Seudah needing to be interrupted to do the mitzvah of Arba Minim, and the halacha in relation to mincha, where you don't need to interrupt. He says there's no difference. One's deraisa, one's rabbana. So that's why there is a difference. But he says there is another contradiction. Robert says, but you brought the wrong contradiction, he says. I'm going to bring a real contradiction. This is very Gemara-like, you were wrong in what you said, but you were right. It's just that you brought the wrong source. So this is what Robert says. Ela Amar Robert. Robert says the following: E kasha or kasha. If you want to find a difficulty, it's a lovely Talmudic logic. Ha kasha. This is going to be the difficulty I'm going to bring. In other words, we're looking for trouble. That's what the Talmud does, because it tries to sort things out. Unless you fight every single fight, you won't know, where all the enemies are over here. We have to make sure that every piece of Gemara is in peace with every other piece of Gemara, so to speak. So he's saying that if you want to find a problem, you can find a problem, and it's in the Mishnah itself. There's a contradiction, he says, between clause 1 of our Mishnah and clause 2. Let's see how he finds a contradiction. You don't have to look elsewhere, another Masechta, to find a problem. You'll find the problem here in situ. What is the problem? The Mishnah said at the beginning, it said, that when he arrives home, he has to immediately take lulav and esrog. And if he started to eat, alma damafsik, he would even have to interrupt a meal. That's what we said. That's what the first part of the Mishnah says. If you started to eat, stop your meal. You've got to take your lulav and esrog. But for Hadatani, the second clause of the Mishnah, and it was only a very short Mishnah, the second clause of the Mishnah said the following: Lo notal shacharis, you told Ben Arboim, if he didn't take it in the morning, he can take it in the afternoon. Why? Because he's got the whole day to do the mitzvah. Alma lo mafsik, from which we could deduce there's no need for him to interrupt a meal. Actually, yes, it's very true. Look at what the second part of the Mishnah said. The first part of the Mishnah was entirely impatient, if you like, about the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Arba Minim. As soon as you get home, you started a meal, panic, 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 pick up the lulav and esrog, put down the meal. That's what the first part of the Mishnah said. Comes the second clause in the Mishnah, entirely relaxed. The pace is completely different. It should have screamed at us when we did this Mishnah. It's as if he didn't take the lulav during Shacharis. Why? For whatever reason. He can still take it in the afternoon because the whole day is fine. Well, if I say to someone, don't worry, you didn't do it in the morning, you've got the afternoon, does it sound like I'm panicking you? Not at all. And indeed, if I start a meal in the afternoon, I would suggest from the second part, I would not need to abandon the meal. I could go to the end of the meal. Kol hayom kosher. There's nothing to worry about. So you've got a panicky first part, which suggests that you have to put all things aside in order to take the lulav and esrog and do your mitzvah as quickly as possible. And you've got a relaxed second part that says, don't worry, even if you haven't done the morning, you've got the whole afternoon, everything's ready until the night comes in. It does seem rather peculiar. So that would be the kasha. So this is the kasha we should ask, that the first part of the Mishnah doesn't seem to be consistent with the second part of the Mishnah. So so on this, Amar Rav Safra, on this, Rav Safra could come in. Rav Safra is the one we brought in who's made this difference right at the beginning between when there is time in the day to when there isn't time in the day. On this, we may have to use that answer to make a difference between the situation of clause 1 in the Mishnah and the situation in clause 2. Lo kasha, we would have to say. The resolve of difficulty, we would say, ha de ikashas bayom, ha de lekashas bayom. So we'd have to say, maybe we'd have to come to this differentiation in circumstances where it says when you come back from your journey and you start a meal, immediately you have to take lulav and esrog, abandon your meal. That's where you come back late in the day. And there isn't going to be much time. So you have to take lulav and esrog straight away. The second clause that says if you haven't taken yet in the morning, you can take it in the afternoon. It's not where you've come back late in the day. It's where you've got time. So it all depends. Simply the Mishnah looks panicky at the beginning because it refers to a situation where time is short. And in the second part of the Mishnah, it's referring to a situation where time isn't short. We're not asking you to end your meal to do the mitzvah. We rely on the fact that when you finish your meal, you'll still be able to do the mitzvah. We're not going to rush you. We don't think that you're going to forget. And if you think about it, you can interpret the Mishnah that way because the first part of the Mishnah said, Misha Bar Derech, he's come back from a long journey. You know, when I say someone's come back from a long journey, I'm really saying that person has probably had a hard day. Yeah, and he had to drive 200 miles. He's come back 200 miles. He's worn out. He's sweaty. He rushes to the shower, and he thinks he's going to start a meal. This guy, you can't trust him to finish his meal. And then remember, he has to do the mitzvah Arba Mina, right? He's not in the mood to think through things properly, and he might just fall asleep. But the second case is not talking about someone who's just come back from a tired, hot journey. It just says, in the general case of a person who hasn't yet done it, he's at home all day anyway, never anything to do. So there we trust the fact that he will do it in time. He's got plenty of time. So in this, you can actually look at the Mishnah and justify the difference between the hurried stance of the first part of the Mishnah and the relaxed stance of the second part of the Mishnah. 1 second. But Omer Rabbi Zera says, himself gives a slightly different answer. He says, in fact, why do you need to even worry about the difference between the part 1 of the Mishnah and part 2 of the Mishnah? Dilma mitzvah la'avsuki. Maybe the first part of the Mishnah is telling us that you should interrupt your meal. You should interrupt your meal. Ve'ilo mitzvah avsuki ve'ilo posuk. If he but if he did, right, he should interrupt the meal. But it's merely telling you in the second part of the Mishnah that if he didn't interrupt his meal, you should know that there's enough time to do Arba Minim even in the afternoon, right up to nighttime. So it's not a recommendation then in the second part of the Mishnah. It's merely telling you that you should interrupt your meal. We are rather panicky, but if you didn't interrupt your meal and you find yourself now after the meal, you should remember that the mitzvah is still applicable all the way to nightfall. And then we don't have a contradiction at all. It's just telling you you've forgotten to interrupt a meal or you didn't interrupt a meal. Okay, but remember when you finished eating that you've got until nightfall to do the mitzvah. Okay. Shekolayam kosher Elo Amar Rabbi Zera, but said Rabbi Zera, Le'olam kita amrinu mi'ikara. He says, actually, you could say what we said before. Remember before, Rava said at an early stage that one was min ha-Torah and one was drabonon. And when we asked for the contradiction between Arba Minim and Mincha, so then we said that Rava came back and he says there's no contradiction. The fact that you have to interrupt for Arba Minim and you don't for Mincha, because Mincha is drabonon, and Arba Minim are min ha-Torah. So Rabbi Zera is now going to say, Le'olam kidu amrin mi'ikara, that there is a contradiction even there. Udakashiloch Hadairaisa Hadrabanan. You wanted to say, hey, they're different. Maybe one was Deraisa and one is Rabban. The mitzvah of Arba Minim is Ulakachtchem Lachem, is Min HaTorah, and Mincha is Rabbanon. Hacha b'yom tom sheim nid Rabbanon askinan. This case, and our Mishnah of taking Arba Minim, maybe wasn't talking about the first day of Sukkot, but one of the subsequent days. In fact, it has to be, as we'll see in a moment. And only the first day is Min HaTorah. Ulakachtem lachem b'yom harishon. Remember, the subsequent days are rabbinical. So now they are the same as Mincha. Mincha is rabbinical, and mitzvah of Sukkah on day 2 onwards is also rabbinical. So then comes back the question: why is it you have to interrupt your meal for lulav and not for mincha? If we're talking about lulav on day 2 onwards, it's rabbinical just like mincha. You can't justify having to interrupt for Arba Minim because it's Min HaTorah, because it isn't now. On day 2 onwards, it's rabbinical. So there you've got to come to a reason that maybe we had enough time in the day or didn't have enough time in the day. But the Gemara's gone back to that point there to say that the difference between Tefillah and Arba Minim, one being Drauraisa and Drabonon, it doesn't apply on the subsequent days. It only applies on day 1. And the Gemara says, Daikonami. This can be, in fact, substantiated by the text of the Mishnah, Midakatoni, since the Mishnah said, Misha bo baderech ve'ein beyodo lulav, someone who came back from a journey and he didn't have a lulav. It has to be talking about day 2 onwards. If you say that that may be talking about the first day, Mishari, would he have been allowed to go out on a journey in the first place? The idea over here, we understand, is he went out on a journey for a purpose. He wasn't just walking to shul. So therefore, we must be talking about day 2 onwards. He wouldn't have been on a journey on day 1. And if it's day 2 onwards, then taking the lulav is rabbinical. And then it becomes the same as mincha. Mincha is also rabbinical. And if there's a difference in the halacha in terms of whether you need to interrupt your meal between mincha and on Sukkot for Arba Minim, then it becomes a problem because the two are on the same level. They're both rabbinical. Okay, I want to point out over here that there's a Tosfos actually who brings another question. Second. Our Mishnah says that a person has to interrupt a meal if they come home, and even if they started a meal, he has to interrupt his meal in order to do Arba Minim. As we said, that was the base case of our Mishnah. He has to interrupt it. Tosfos actually brings a discussion in the Seches Brochos, and then also in Psochim, which talks about Kiddush on Friday night. And there's opinion according to Rabbi Yossi that if a person has started a meal on Friday afternoon, say, and that meal, either he started Shabbos a bit early, if you like, he started eating his Shabbos meal early, or maybe this was a meal that sort of stretched over a long party into night, and that meal is still ongoing when Shabbos comes in. The Mishnah actually says that he can finish the meal, not the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi says he can finish the meal and then make Kiddush. Big Kiddush, right? Nights come in, he's eating the meal, he hasn't made Kiddush yet. Says Rabbi Yossi, he can finish the meal, drag it on for another hour and a half, and make Kiddush at 11 o'clock at night, no problem. So Tosfos says, well, hang on a moment. That is a mitzvah midaraisa, even before you come to day 1 or day 2 for Arba Minim. Kiddush is min HaTorah. Zachoras Yom HaShabbos l'Kadsheu is a mitzvah min HaTorah. And we understand that to mean Kiddush, l'Kadsheu. We sanctify Shabbos when it comes in by making Kiddush. So if Kiddush is a mitzvah min HaTorah, then why can we allow this person to continue his meal and not just bench up and make Kiddush when Shabbos comes in? Why do we say that he has to finish his meal to take Arba Minim, but he doesn't have to finish his meal in order to make Kiddush? So Tosfos tries to make a differentiation between the two, and he says that it's possible that we could say about Kiddush that the mitzvah of Kiddush, even if you haven't made it on Friday night, extends through Shabbos. So you haven't necessarily missed the mitzvah of Kiddush, even if you fell asleep at the meal, as most people do on a Friday night, and you forgot to make Kiddush on Friday night, you could still make it. You probably make the proper Kiddush rather than just the mini one we make, before we eat lunch. But you can make Kiddush because you haven't yet been Yotze Kiddush. You can make Kiddush a little bit later as well. So since you've got more time to say Kiddush, we won't force you to terminate your meal early and make Kiddush straight away. However, when it comes to Arba Minim, once night comes in, you've lost the mitzvah for the day. Yes, there's another mitzvah tomorrow, but that's tomorrow's mitzvah of Arba Minim. You can't say that today's mitzvah extends through till tomorrow. It doesn't. Kiddush extends through the whole of Saturday, if you like, but the mitzvah of Arba Minim doesn't. So that might be why we're a little bit more relaxed with Kiddush and don't require you to close the meal. Having said that, I don't believe we paskin like Rabbi Yossi. I think we paskin you do have to close the meal. And it's a bit unusual. We wouldn't be in such a situation where we haven't made Kiddush and we were eating merrily through nighttime. But I believe the halacha is not like this Rabbi Yossi. But the very fact that Rabbi Yossi doesn't have a problem with it, even though it was mitzvah in the Torah, provokes Tosfos to contrast it with our Mishnah, which is so strict as far as Arba Minim is concerned, and to come up with this possible answer that where you've got the whole day for Kiddush, maybe that's why Rabbi Yossi believes he doesn't need to force you to make Kiddush ASAP. But when it comes to Arba Minim, since you only have until nighttime, that you're bound to have to do the mitzvah as quickly as possible. We're afraid that mitzvah otherwise will be lost. Okay, I'm going to stop over here because we've reached the next Mishnah,